The Leon Panetta 2025 Lecture Series. What will be the legacy of the Trump era? This lecture discusses tariffs, tax cuts, debt, and inflation. What will be the economic legacy of the Trump era? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you back to the Leon Panetta Lecture Series live here in Leon's hometown of Monterey at the Monterey Conference Center. For almost 3 decades, we have organized these series of discussions because we saw a need in our community to create an opportunity for respectful, honest, and balanced dialogue about the challenges we face as a nation. Today, when our nation is experiencing so much division, these conversations are more important than ever. Leon and I are proud that the community continues to support these important programs and allows us to bring them live to the audience here tonight. To those watching at home and to the students who joined us this afternoon. And by the way, I just want to share with you, I was there with the students. And despite the fact that it's spring break for most schools, we had a nice turnout of students, and they asked the most wonderful, the smartest questions. We were very, very impressed, and it was wonderful to see our students asking some of the questions they did. They are our future, and that's what made me so proud. And Leon and I are proud that this community continues to support these important programs and allow us to bring them live to the audience here, to those watching at home, and again to the students who joined us this afternoon. Last November, after an election like no other, Americans went to the polls and elected Donald Trump for a second term as president. His first 50 days in office have been a whirlwind of executive orders and disruption of long-held beliefs about American democracy and our place in the world. As we look ahead to the next 4 years, what will be the legacy of the Trump era? Tonight, we look at the economy. During the campaign, Trump promised voters a golden age, the best jobs, the biggest paycheck, and the brightest economic future the world has ever seen. Now his administration is bracing Americans for a possible recession. Tariffs are rising, stocks are falling, consumer confidence is dropping, inflation is rising, and forecasters have reduced estimates for economic growth. We are now in a full-blown trade war with Mexico, Canada, China, and possibly Europe as well. The president has said that there might be a, quote, little disturbance, unquote. But how much will it cost our economy? Can President Trump provide a large tax cut without adding trillions to a record national debt? Leon will pose these and other questions to 5 economic policy experts. Our first guest is one of the world's leading economic scholars, an expert in economic history and macroeconomics from January 2009 until September 2010. She served as chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. She helped formulate the response to the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent recession. She's presently the professor of the graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, and a research association of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Please welcome Dr. Christina Romer. Our second guest served as the 70th Secretary of the Treasury and is considered one of the most knowledgeable financial leaders to serve in the office. Before entering public service, he worked for 26 years at Goldman Sachs and Company, where he rose to the position of co-chairman. He assisted President Clinton to develop an economic policy that helped to spark and sustain the longest economic expansion in the nation's history. He helped to transform the nation's budgetary position from deficit to surplus, and producing the lowest national rates of unemployment in decades. Please welcome Secretary Robert Rubin. Our next guest served as U.S. Trade Representative from 2006 to 2009 in the Bush administration. As a member of the President's Cabinet, public policy scholar, and global strategic corporate executive, she is considered a foremost expert on global trade relations. Her efforts as the USTR included work to dramatically increase free trade agreements, resolve trade disputes, and enforce existing agreements. During her tenure as USTR, she launched the initial Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and engaged in the Doha Round talks at the World Trade Organization. Please welcome Ambassador Susan Schwab. Our next guest served as Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Executive Secretary of the White House National Economic Council in the administration of George W. Bush. In 2006, he was named a member of the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve System and served until 2011. He was the Fed's representative to the G20 and emissary to the emerging and advanced economics in Asia. He has written and spoken extensively on the Great Recession and the road to economic recovery. Please welcome Governor Kevin Warsh. Finally, we have an additional guest who decided to join his good friend, Secretary Rubin, for important discussions. Our surprise final speaker has worked in the administrations of two presidents, helping to direct economic policy to strengthen the United States industrial capacity. During the Obama administration, he was acting director of the Office of Management and Budget and was a senior advisor to the president. He later served in the Biden administration as director of the White House National Economic Council, where he advised the president on domestic and international economic policy and coordinated the administration's economic agenda. Now, please welcome Brian Deese. Moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district, and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, and a whole bunch of other things. He is also the former House Budget Committee chairman and director of the Office of Management and Budget. He knows that a strong economy and responsible fiscal policy are essential to the health of our democracy. So please welcome our own Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, and good evening, and welcome to this, the 28th year of the Panetta Lecture Series. Sylvia and I want to first of all thank all of you for your support and for your loyalty to this program. We could not do it without you. It's great to see a great audience tonight. I think it's fair to say we've always had relevant themes. But tonight, we've got one hell of a relevant theme, which is what will be the legacy of the Trump era. Our democracy is being tested. Tested in our economy, tested in law enforcement, in foreign policy, in governing. And we'll cover a lot of those issues in our lecture series. But tonight we focus on the economy. The economy is in some turmoil at the present time. There's the threat of higher inflation. There are increasing tariffs. There's the possibility of a recession. All of that is impacted on the markets. President Trump insists that high tariffs and trade wars will renew our economy. Even the Wall Street Journal calls the resulting trade war the dumbest in history. Will the Trump economic legacy result in a golden age or in a recession? We'll explore these challenges with one of the best panels of economic experts we've ever put together. So I welcome all the speakers. Thank you for coming this evening. Let me begin with the question at the top of the list, which is, we are obviously seeing a lot of turmoil. We've got declining markets. We do have on-again, off-again high tariffs. We do have, obviously, the beginning of a number of trade wars, large cuts to the federal workforce, unemployment edging up, tax cuts that could further increase a record debt if they're not paid for. A president who says that this is a little disturbance or a period of transition to a stronger economy. So the question is, where are we headed? What do you believe is the current state of the economy? Are we headed towards a golden age, or are we headed towards a recession? Christina?
All right, well, I'll start with sort of where we're headed, where we are now and where we're headed maybe over the next year or year and a half. And I think the big picture is where we are right now is fine, right? So inflation is a lot lower than it was a couple of years ago. The unemployment rate, though it's inched up, is still low by historical standards, and GDP growth is not robust, but it's certainly positive, and that's a good sign. So, and if things just stayed as they are, we'd probably say they're fine. We are having a lot of policy on trade with the tariffs, which I know we'll talk a lot about. My best guess is the direct effect of the tariffs will be a little bit negative. So cause some inflation, cause some loss of efficiency, output growth lower than it otherwise would have been. But if it's just, sort of the direct effect of the tariff, probably not so bad. I think the thing that worries me is just the sense of policy uproar, right? So I think what we're seeing in the markets, what you're seeing if you talk to businesses, business leaders, they're just nervous, right? There is so much policy. There's tariffs doing this one day and that the next day. And I think it's that, economies don't do well with chaotic policy. And so if I had to single out what makes me the most nervous, it is this sense of policy uncertainty, that's making economic agents, our households, our businesses, nervous. And when people get uncertain, what they tend to do is nothing, right? They don't consume, they don't invest, and that can be devastating for the economy. So if I had to say, you know, what's the probability of recession? It's certainly gone up in the last couple of months. It's still not over 50%. A lot of the best analysts say kind of 30%, but it's a very real possibility exactly because we're starting to see consumer spending slip. We're starting to see investment slip. And so that's, to me, the big risk factor.
Bob?
Yeah, I would, I guess, express it this way, Leon. I was asked recently at the Council of Foreign Relations, which I was chairman, or had been chairman until recently, to do the same thing we're talking about right here. And what I said was that I started 60 years ago at Goldman Sachs. I've been involved in decision-making ever since, in one way or another. And I think this is the most uncertain, most complex outlook for the short term and the long term in my entire career, except for brief moments like the missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think the administration's policies, both the existing ones and the ones that seem to be forthcoming, or likely to be forthcoming, have substantially increased that risk. And just to mention a few, I think probably have a more concerned view about tariffs than currently expressed. I think DOGE is a disaster. There undoubtedly are excess costs, there are undoubtedly excess regulations, but Leon, when you and I were there, under your leadership, we looked at that systematically and with discipline. We didn't go at it with a crash and burn and slash and burn, and I think we're doing tremendous damage to our government and to the recipients of government programs. The attacks on the universities are one of the great strengths of our nation, and we're now attacking them. The Vice President of the United States said recently on television, because I heard him, the professors are the enemies. I don't think they're the enemies, Leon. I think the professors are the teachers of our future. So I think there's a great deal. Oh, and the rule of law. The president, that time candidate, talked a lot about retribution, and unfortunately, I think retribution is infusing a lot of what is being done in policy, and I think that it is tremendously damaging. So I think that the short and longer term risks to our economy are very, very substantial.
Susan, I'm going to skip you just a second and go to Kevin. You've heard the criticisms, Kevin. What do you think?
So I'm starting to think like I got set up here. So Leon calls me and says, hey, old friend, you know, you're a pal of my daughter-in-law's, Judge Panetta. We're just going to have some friendly people over out in Monterey, beautiful views, just have a nice, honest discussion about how things are. First, it's an honor to be here, even if it's a setup. I would love to do the pile-on. The president, I think, has been president for 54 days. He inherited an economy that was a fiscal mess, a monetary mess, and a regulatory mess. And according to these distinguished gentlemen, it's amazing he must have taken a perfect economy in 54 days and brought it to the brink. Well, the economy, let's just spend a moment on each of those, then I'll go back to Leon. Our government is spending 53% more than the day before the pandemic. And I don't remember 5 years ago thinking this is some austere, efficient government. People like Leon and Bob and the rest of us should say 53% more. Are we 53% better? Are we providing for the least well-off among us 53% more? Gosh, no. So the president inherited a fiscal mess, and we funded it at very low interest rates. It's not obvious those are going to happen. Monetary. My old friends at the central bank were part of the regime that created the largest inflation that we've had in modern history. Now, all of us did okay. We have financial assets. 52% of our fellow Americans have no financial assets, and inflation was a deeply regressive tax that's done harm to them. And today, as we sit here, inflation is about 60% higher than the Fed's target. So we have an inflation problem that the president inherited too. And I'll just say one more: regulatory policy. The last administration put so much sand in the gears of the US economy and slowed down this dynamic, incredible economy. And the new administration has to do something about it. So we can fight about all that's happened in the last 55 days, but I'm surprised to somehow suggest that the economy was in great shape coming into today.
I'm not going to do this because I already had a chance to speak, but I would love to respond. I won't, but I won't, Kevin.
Let's have Brian respond.
Yeah.
Well, I want to respond with 2 points. The first is a quick cautionary story on predicting recessions. So in the period Kevin was talking about, in my last job, I had the unfortunate duty of walking into the Oval Office starting in the fall of 2021 and having the president say, what are the markets saying is the odds that there's going to be a recession? I would say, Mr. President, they're predicting the 50% chance of recession in the next 6 months. And then 3 months later, I would walk into the Oval Office and he would say, what are the markets saying is the odds of a recession? I would say, markets are now predicting is a 50% chance of recession in 6 months. And we did that 3 or 4 times through the course of time. Of course, there was no recession. The key reason over the course of the last 3 years that there has not been a recession, notwithstanding the fact that most economic models and most forecasters got to close to 100%, is that the American consumer continued to spend and continue to power the economy forward. 70% of the economy is consumption, notwithstanding the fact that their outlook was dour about the economy. So I think as we look forward and we say what are the odds of recession, I think the thing we need to look most closely at is what are consumers actually doing? And there I think that over the course of the last 6 to 8 weeks, there are some concerning and cautionary signs that we may actually be seeing the compounding uncertainty to that. And so that's where, when I look at this, I say, we should be cautious and humble about anybody being able to predict when the knife falls and when the music stops. But I do think we see more signs today than we had. And we will, we can debate the circumstances of a administration over the course of the last 54 days. But if you look at the economy at the end of 2024, you had stronger growth, you had lower unemployment, you had inflation that had come down at a faster rate than not only any other major industrialized country in the world, but also then we have performed as a country coming out of any major economic crisis in the last 50 years. And so while there are things there that we could have done better in the last administration for sure, the degree of uncertainty that we've got in the economy today, bleeding over, the last thing I'll say is they ask consumers, they do these consumer sentiment surveys where they go and they ask, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about the future? And in the last couple of weeks, something very unique has happened. Consumers, typical Americans, are saying their top concern is policy uncertainty. What's unique about it, in most consumer surveys, policy never enters into the equation. Most typical Americans aren't even paying attention to what's going on in policy. And so it has the American public and the American consumer's attention. What happens from here, we will see. But that's where my concern is.
Yeah. Sally, let me ask you to comment on the larger issue, but I'd like you to also address the tariff question as well, since you've been a trade representative. In an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, it said, and I quote, "Protectionism has an unblemished record of failure, both economically and politically throughout American history," unquote. What's your view of the strategy of, doing higher tariffs in order to ultimately try to convert our economy?
So I would say I will start with the uncertainty as the output. This administration inherited a totally moribund trade policy from the last administration, except that the first Trump administration raised a whole bunch of tariffs, but negotiated some interesting trade agreements that I worry they're going to be walking away from now, including Phase 1 agreement with China, and the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So the beginning of my answer to you is, I'm not sure what the strategy is yet. It makes me kind of nervous. And when we hear the president and others in the administration talk about tariffs, we hear that tariffs are leverage to get other countries to change their behavior. They are to address national security issues. They are to address fentanyl. They are to address immigration. They are to address foreign unfair trade practices. They are to wall off the U.S. market so that we can build competitive auto and or shipbuilding and or name your sector behind it. And and a pay for to fill the gap between what we spend as a country and what we bring in the way of revenues. The math on that one doesn't work, but we'll come back to that. It turns out that those objectives, in some cases, are mutually exclusive. As in, if you are going to raise tariffs so high to protect an industry that the U.S. industry can thrive behind that tariff wall, then product is not going to come in, and you don't have your pay-for revenues, right? You don't have your revenues to go into the budget. The same can be said of leverage. If it's leverage and then you actually raise the tariffs, as somebody said, you've shot the hostage. And you've shot the hostage and you haven't accomplished your objectives. So going to a sort of a Main Street view, the uncertainty is, one, if you are a manufacturer and your inputs are facing tariffs, steel and aluminum, lumber, if you're a home builder, then you are looking at paying tariffs now that you didn't count on when you placed your orders 6 months ago. And you're thinking about placing orders for 6 months from now, and you haven't a clue what the cost of your inputs will be. If you're an automaker, that is also going to challenge your competitiveness vis-a-vis imported autos. If you are a manufacturer that exports, or a farmer who exports, or a service provider, you are facing the prospect of retaliation by other countries, and markets that you might have spent decades building up will go away, will vanish in a moment. And so that kind of uncertainty, some of it with lasting consequences, even if the tariffs come back down, not surprisingly worry a lot of people. But we don't know yet. If you asked me this question on April 3rd, I would probably have a different answer, because a whole lot is going to be announced on the 2nd of April.
Bob, let me ask you, President Trump floated the idea of replacing the income taxes with tariffs to fund the government. Economists are generally skeptical because the IRS collects about $5.1 trillion each year, and it would be near impossible to raise the level of funds with tariffs. Can tariffs replace the income tax?
A tariff is, roughly speaking, Leon, a tax, because it's going to be borne largely by consumers. I think the answer both arithmetically is no, and I think substantively, and I think Kevin may have a different view of this than I do, but I think tax increases within a reasonable range do very little adverse effect to the economy. There was an interesting study done after the 2017 tax cuts by one of the major financial firms. It was done with respect to the 2017 tax cuts not too long ago. And they estimated those tax cuts increased growth in the United States by about 0.1% per annum. In other words, virtually not at all. At the same time, I think tariffs, I think maybe Susan started at this, I think pose very serious threats to our economy in affecting competitiveness and retaliation. So I think the answer to your question is it's a substitute tax for the income tax or other taxes, but I think with substantially harmful potential effects. Whereas the tax increases, I think we very badly need, what I suspect have very little adverse economic effect.
Kevin, let me ask you, obviously, the hope is that Trump will be able to extend the tax cuts from 2017, a lot of which are expiring in 2025. But as Bob just pointed out, tariffs are a tax. So why would a Republican president who's trying to cut taxes support a major tax increase with tariffs?
So let me see if I can just give 30 seconds of perspective, and then I'll promise I'm not going to dodge the question. The mentor of mine, who was much older than these guys on stage, who taught me whatever I know about economics, was George Shultz. And George presided as Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, all sorts of things in the post-World War II era of US economic and geopolitical policy. And he created, President Reagan and others, a new security and economic commons with multilateral institutions that put the US on trade and other issues in a strong position. The World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. See if I could state this plainly. Those multilateral organizations have failed us over the course of the last couple of decades. And I think it's asking a lot of a new president to have fixed all that in 55 days. I do not know exactly the trajectory we're going to be going on tariff policy, but I do believe, in order to answer the earlier question, if you wanted to put this economy in recession, if you wanted to make Brian's old job easier, if the 2017 tax cuts expire and we go back to the higher tax rates that preceded them on January of next year, I will strongly predict you will be back in a recession. Secondly, I would say, contrary to the analysis that Bob cites, that most analysis that I and others have done showed in the 2017 tax cuts there was a big surprise, a gusher of revenue into the US Treasury. Revenue right now relative to GDP at the end of the Biden administration into the Trump administration is about the post-war average. There's only one thing that is extraordinary, and that's the level of spending, where we are spending as if we are fighting World War II all over again. We are spending as if we're still in the deepest, darkest days of COVID. Christie's got it right. The economy is more or less at full employment, and we shouldn't be spending money we don't have, borrowing it from people that don't quite like us, at interest rates we can't afford for projects that we don't need.
So therefore, are you for paying for the extension of the tax cuts? I mean, we're talking about adding anywhere from $4 to $10 trillion to the debt.
So
how are we just going to borrow that money, or are we going to try to pay down what that bill's going to cost?
So I think we do need to massively reduce the deficit and debt overhangs that the administration has inherited. I think the people that are joining me on stage should be outraged by the spending of the last 4 years, should be as troubled by it as they are by the other policy questions that are being raised. We're spending $3 billion a day on interest expense. 4 years ago, we were spending $1 billion a day on interest expense. Our debt is 50% larger. We're doing this at a time of relatively full employment. So I take all that very seriously. Where I disagree is on how much this would cost. If we don't extend the president's 2017 tax cuts, contrary to the analysis of Goldman Sachs and others, I don't think that the difference in GDP will be 0.1%. I think it would put us into a recession. And similarly, in a recession, the gusher of revenues that we had grown accustomed to would disappear. If we keep the same tax rates in 2026 for the next 10 years, then that doesn't cost us anything. That gives us an economy a chance to invest in a new generation of technologies, so we're in a stronger position to do it. So my own sense, Leon, is it would be a drastic mistake to increase taxes at the end of this year. It would put us in bad shape economically, worse shape from a deficit perspective, and geopolitically put us in a very difficult position at the most consequential moment in the US economy probably that we've had since 1980.
Christina?
Yeah, I do want to jump in. So first, I'll join you by saying, you know, the deficit that we're currently running, have been running through the first Trump administration and through the Biden administration, about 6% of GDP, right? And it's one thing to do that in the middle of COVID or middle of the Great Recession. But in times when you're at full employment, I will join you and say a 6% deficit is a travesty. And it is something that we absolutely have to we have to bring that down. And we've got two people in this room that have actually done it before. So I think that I will agree completely. I think the trouble is, I think you're kind of trying to have things both ways. So you can't keep the tax cuts and cut spending, or you've got to do both of those things. It's just unrealistic to think you could actually get the deficit down by a large amount by only cutting spending, especially only cutting discretionary defense, non-defense discretionary spending. That's a tiny part of the government budget. So we're going to have to make some hard choices on other types of spending. And we're almost surely going to need to raise revenue. And so kind of coming up with a plan that's realistic has to have both those elements.
Brian, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just going back to your question about using tariff revenues to plug a hole in the budget deficit. First of all, the math doesn't work. I think the Congressional Budget Office did a study on 10% across the board tariffs and 60% tariffs against China, and came up with $2.2 trillion in revenues over 10 years, which is real money, except it's $200 billion a year, which is chump change compared to the deficit we face. Being able to have growth, competitive industries, growth in this economy that is vibrant, that is generating tax payments, that's generating new industries and so on, I think probably is a much stronger approach. And I would go back to a point that I alluded to earlier, which is we have trade policy problems. I mean, there are countries that don't treat our exports well. And we have problems, particularly with China, with non-market economy policies that result in overcapacity and dumped and subsidized product all over the world, including in the United States, because they don't have to face a bottom line. They're not looking for profits. They're looking for market share, and that is decimating manufacturing all over the world. However, I would argue that's what you use your trade leverage for, and that is fundamentally important. I'm not sure you raise tariffs for the purpose of rearranging who's paying the taxes.
Brian, looking again at that tax cut, we're talking about losing revenue anywhere from $4 trillion to as high as, I think some of the estimates go to 10, even close to 12 trillion. So what do you do? Do you extend the tax cut and put it on the debt? Do you extend the tax cut and pay for it? Or do you not extend the tax cut?
So look, I think Washington is getting shockingly close to violating the first law of holes. And the first law of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. And so I would say the most important thing is that there should be a commitment to a rule that if we're going to use reconciliation, and I would apply this to Democrat and Republican administrations as well, that whatever set of domestic priorities you want to move, that you should have to at least offset all of those priorities. Now, to Kevin's point, you can make choices. You can try to offset that with spending or with revenue. The problem with the direction we're moving in now is that the House, the Republican majority in the House, passed a bill that, as a starting point, says you can do $4.5 trillion of tax cuts and you have to find about $1.5 trillion of savings. Now, I think it's going to be hard for them to only find that $1.5 trillion. It's going to be hard for them to stay within $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. But their starting point is to say that we can add $3 trillion to the debt. And I think that's part of the challenge. And as as Kevin and Bob and Chris, all of us on this stage know, the challenge as these budget issues agree is that they get worse as you get into the negotiations. People start to use gimmicks. I was at something this weekend where somebody said, well, a great way to do this is we shorten the bill, we cut it to 5 years, and we cut the cost in half. You don't cut the cost in half, but that might be the way that you get it through. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to recognize that there are constraints. And then I think when you do that, you start to get into some really hard issues, right? On the revenue side, I just make like one fact. If we went back to the revenue system that existed in the late 1990s, when these gentlemen were stewards of the economy, today, that would be revenue between 19 and 20% of GDP, okay? So we'd close that 6% gap to 3. The economy performed pretty well during that period, and so it sort of disproves the idea that you can't run an economy to achieve our economic goals with a revenue system like that. At the same time, Kevin is right. Spending aggregate government spending is at about 23% of GDP, but to bring that down, Christie is right. You got to go where the money is, and where the money is in entitlements. It's in Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. And politically, that has become an issue that neither party is prepared to tackle. But leadership is hard, and right now, the Republicans are in the lead. And so we need to see some leadership that if there really is a spending problem, then you need to go where the money is, because DOGE and sort of making scapegoats of government programs where there isn't the money, and I would argue there isn't the goat to scape, but I think you're going to have to see some real leadership on that front. So I think that's the answer is you could do it, but that would require a degree of leadership and commitment to make hard choices that I'm worried we're not seeing.
Kevin, respond to the issue of, where do you go in spending in order to deal with the debt? Because 2/3 of federal spending is entitlement programs. It's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, farm support programs, payment on interest, et cetera.
I think it's more than that. I think so close to 3/4 now, Leon.
It's almost 3/4? Okay. And so the rest is a little bit on discretionary, maybe about 12%, and the rest is on defense. So both parties now are saying we're not going to touch Social Security, we're not going to touch Medicare, we're not going to touch those programs. So what are you left with?
So what you need to do is, for the last 20 years and more, we've been relying on the kindness of strangers to make our budget work. We've been trying to find people overseas that will buy U.S. treasuries so that we can bridge what seems to be this very difficult thing to bridge. So who are the biggest 4 buyers of our treasury since the 2008 financial crisis? I'll just list them quickly. 1, the Federal Reserve. Since the 2008 crisis, we, the Federal Reserve, bought debt from our cousin over at the Treasury Department. After the inflation surge, that's more difficult. So the Fed is now out of that market. Second, the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese, I don't want to go into a long discussion here, I'm not so sure they're going to keep doing us so many favors. So they're going to be pulling out of that market. Third, Japan. The dirty little secret is the Japanese economy is stronger than it's been in our adult lifetimes, so they're going to be investing at home. And the fourth were the largest banks and insurance companies that we central bankers, as bank regulators, said, you should go buy some debt from the Treasury and it'll all be okay. Well, we've been relying on them to sort of make this budget work. What I think we now need to do is to buy some insurance. So Leon is right about long-term structural budget challenges, but we should get started where we can on discretionary spending. We need to convince market participants in the US and around the world that the United States is prepared to lead again, that we are going to have an economy that is the envy of the world. Our growth can be stronger, and you should invest here. And we are going to be fiscally responsible for the first time in a couple of decades. So we begin with, this is a very dangerous word to use, DOGE, and we begin by trying to get spending back to those radical, austere levels of the day before COVID. If we can get back to that and demonstrate to the markets that the United States is serious again about trying to change the direction of our fiscal spending, trying to liberate the citizenry from a more obtrusive government, then I think we could buy ourselves some time. Is that the perfect solution? Absolutely not. Leon and Bob are right, but I think we should get started where we can find some agreement.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about that before I go into the second half of the program. It's basically the issue of the Budget Act versus Doge. Past administrations have been able to use the budget in order to deal with either spending savings or efficiency or trying to improve government in some way. Bob and I experienced that in the Clinton administration. I mean, we sat down with the president, went line item by line item through the whole budget. We added funding to those programs that were working. We took funding away from the programs that weren't working, or we got rid of them. We achieved $500 billion in deficit reduction. That worked. It worked. And that's what the law requires, is that you follow the Budget Act. Now we're in a situation where we've got a Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk, both of whom have not been approved by the Senate, who are basically going ahead and slashing at spending, violating the law, running into court decisions, basically creating even greater turmoil. I mean, why doesn't the president just do the budget? So what you're supposed to do?
I have a sneaking suspicion I might not be invited back. So this might be my last time with you. Listen, if Leon were back in government, we'd be in better shape. So I can't disagree with that. But in 2025, the president hasn't proposed his budget yet because he's been in office a very short period of time. It is not obvious to me of the Doge cuts in the current fiscal year, how much of those will stick. The courts and others might weigh in. Collective bargaining from union workers might weigh in. Violations of the Administrative Procedures Act might affect things. But as Brian said, we make budgets in the US government on a 10-year basis. And if what we're seeing in the first 6 or 7 or 8 months is a demonstration effect, that is, there's a lot of waste in our government. There's a lot of fraud even, and there's a lot of abuse. And we can also see places where the government's working effectively and efficiently. It wouldn't at all surprise me that in year 1 that the budget doesn't look radically different than the budget that we inherited from the Biden administration. But in years 2 through 10, it could be a change. When Bob and Leon were in government and President Clinton and others were in high office, there would be experimental projects, and they would say, you can spend millions or tens of millions on this and see how it goes. You can even spend billions on this. The bad news is their successors haven't spent millions and billions. They've spent trillions. We've spent $6 trillion on stimulus in an economy that's at full employment. I don't want to be the sort of budget strident teacher up here, but the trillions are money that we cannot afford. Even the growth rates that can be improved are creating a burden for our kids and our grandkids. And so I do think that by the time we get to year 2, if the politics can change, if groups like this, instead of saying, we need to spend more money in my district, say, you know what I'm hearing in my district is people that have had to make tough decisions around their kitchen table, and they want the government to start to make tough decisions too. If the politics on the other side of this are better, we can start to have a size of government that we can afford and a private sector that can grow. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be difficult, and there will be examples of things that have gone wrong. But I don't think we can continue at the current course. I think it's the current course that's very dangerous. And maybe things have not been done with the best of theater, but if we continue to go down the track of the next 4 years that we've done for the last 4, that when it comes to the great rivalry of the 20th century between the US and what is the equivalent of a Cold War adversary, We are not going to be in a position to win it, and win it we must.
Okay, thank you very much for the first part of this lecture.
Can I just add
Sure,
just one
quickly.
thing here, which is, even if you take what you're saying as given, that you want to make a demonstration on the spending side, which I can understand wanting to make a demonstration. Why not make a demonstration on the tax side too, right? Why just say we're going to cut spending and not raise at least some taxes as a way of trying to solve what we all 6 of us agree is a big problem, which is just a persistent deficit. So.
You want to respond?
I thought that was a rhetorical question.
Never mind, we know the answer. All right, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team. These are the people who select questions for the second half of the program. And I'd ask you to hold your applause until I introduce each of them. Mike Clancy, who's KSQD FM 90.7. David Kellogg, who's the managing editor of the Monterey Herald. Doug McKnight, who is the general manager of KAZU Radio. We had Pete Wawersky from the San Francisco Chronicle, but he wasn't able to make it. Would you please give all of them a hand? And Sylvia and I want to again thank all of the Panetta Institute Board of Directors, the lecture series sponsors that make these programs possible and allow us to share these important discussions with all of you, our audience watching at home, and with the students that we had in our program from across the Central Coast. If you would please give all of those sponsors a hand, I'd appreciate it. All right. First question. President Trump recently held the first cryptocurrency summit in the White House and announced his intention to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Is his embrace of cryptocurrency industry a good thing or a bad thing? Who wants to take that on? Brian?
Sure. Look, I think this is a country that has thrived on having financial innovation and having the ability to create new products and services and innovate. It's also thrived on the fact that financial innovation operates within a set of rules and a set of constraints that make sure that people aren't taken advantage of and that we don't open ourselves up to either financial risk or international interference. I think that basic approach is the right approach to apply to crypto, which is a financial innovation. There's a range of views. Some view it as having no redeeming financial or social value other than an arbitrage for illegal activity. Other people see as intrinsic value. But in any case, there's room for innovation within a set of rules. And those rules can evolve, should evolve, and frankly, should involve Congress because there is a lack of clarity among regulatory agencies around who is responsible. And in some case, what's happening right now is there is an arbitrage between regulators, and that in and of itself is creating a problem. That is all separate from this crypto reserve, which I think shares two problems. One is there is no policy justification for a crypto reserve. And so we're solving a problem that doesn't exist. The thing I'm more worried about, though, Leon, is the circumstances of this, and all of us have served in government in this. This is a specific example of a more general problem that I'm quite worried about around self-dealing and the risk of corruption and fraud. That the people who are the most involved in setting up the crypto reserve, many of them are what's called special government employees, and so they've come into government, haven't had to divest. You know, we all have been through this process. You have to divest your assets, you have to publicly disclose. When you're a special government employee, you can only serve for 240 days in government, but you don't have to disclose any of your holdings, nor do you have to divest of any of them. And so a lot of the people who are in charge of this are known to have, we don't know because we don't have full transparency, but are known to have major holdings in this. And even that appearance, I fear there is more than the appearance, but even that appearance of corruption or self-dealing it has the potential to have negative broader ramifications. So I worry about that.
Okay, next question. 2025 debt estimate, we've been talking about this, is $36.2 trillion. It's 120% of GDP with the annual interest of 16 to 18% of federal revenues. I think interest payments on the debt are now the second largest area of payment in the budget. At what point, or have we passed the point, at what point does this threaten national security and or our solvency as a country? Bob?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite the right number, though, Leon. The 36, whatever you said, is counts as Social Security Trust Fund.
Right.
I think the publicly held debt of the federal government is about 100% of GDP, which is about 28 trillion or some number like that. Look, I think we all agree that this is. Mike Mullins, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified once, and he was asked that when he was still chairman, and he was asked, "What's the biggest national security issue the country faces?" He said, "Our deficit." And I think it was in large measure because he was concerned about whether we would have the resources to have the capabilities we need to deal with a very dangerous world. So I think it's a horrendous problem. But I don't. Is that your question?
That's the question.
Well, that's my answer. But you know, the damnedest thing, we could get out of this. We have all kinds of, Kevin's alluded to this somewhat incorrectly, but nevertheless. Kevin alluded to this. We have tremendous strengths as a country. The dynamism. We have a great university system if these people don't succeed in tearing it down. We have all sorts of strengths that, well, when the vice president said that our biggest enemies, pressers are our biggest enemies, I think it's a little bit of a troubling issue, but anyway. But I think we have tremendous strengths, and we have AI coming along. I started a year and a half ago taking a tutorial twice a week in AI because I thought it might make a difference, AI. I've come to believe what Kissinger said in his recent book with Eric. Well, Kissinger died now, but the book that he and Eric wrote about the potential for AI affecting on the positive side. There's some risks too. So I think there's a lot we have working for us, Leon, but we have to get our house in order politically.
Let me, talking about the national debt, let's talk about the debt limit just real quickly. President Trump has mentioned abolishing the debt limit. Others are talking about putting it on autopilot so that it increases automatically. What happened in my day is Congress had to vote on extending the debt limit because Congress are the people who increase spending. So now they got to vote to increase the debt limit. That's become obviously difficult. I understand that. So what should we do? Should the debt limit be put on automatic pilot, or should it be required to be voted on?
I'd like to.
Go ahead, Sally.
So I spent 8 years on the Hill going through this kind of exercise as a Senate staffer. It is an artifice to be voting on the debt limit, on raising the debt ceiling. And I think the president is right. It is politicians using up a huge amount of political capital, and every time the party in power gets pummeled by the party out of power, and at the end of the day, it's going to get voted on, and we use a whole lot of time and a whole lot of political capital when we should be actually focusing on substance. So I think it's just it's a waste of time and energy. So I don't feel strongly about it.
Any disagreement? Brian?
Can I say one aside that I assume Kevin will agree with, but it would be interesting if
See, they're picking on me when I'm not even saying anything.
Which is, I agree that the debt limit is that sound fiscal rules, we need them and we need people to constrain them. The debt limit has long since become more of a threat than a help. But the debt limit, when it is abolished, the debt limit needs to be congressionally abolished. And this is one of these things that I worry that if anyone gets, Elon Musk or the president or otherwise, gets in their head that the debt limit can be abolished without an act of Congress. I have, and maybe some of the others have been in red team exercises of what would it look like to hold a treasury auction the day after you have tripped the debt limit, and no amount of saying it should be abolished, and so therefore we are going to run through it, will get rid of that threat. So I agree with the president. I do think it's outlived its purposes. I do think that we need to abolish it, and Congress does need to do that, because even the risk of running that hypothetical, could cause real lasting damage to the country.
Christina, you agree?
I do agree. I agree with kind of both of you, but the part of yours, we need to be making our budget decisions in an orderly, congressional, way. And if Congress votes on a budget, they are voting to spend a certain amount of money. That means they're going to have to issue the debt to cover that if there's a deficit. And so I think they should make one decision and make it well, and then I think the debt limit should just follow.
Kevin, I'll send this to you. Because of the economic uncertainty that we've talked about in terms of present policies, could it cause the dollar to be replaced as the world's dominant reserve currency?
So as I look around the world, no one seems to be giving us much of a run for irresponsibility. So one would have thought over the course of the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, as the U.S. economic policy has been, I would say, deficient. Before the 2008 crisis, the rest of the world thought we knew how to run a banking system. Before the great inflation surge, people thought, well, that central bank, they sure know how to keep prices stable. Before the COVID pandemic, they said, well, those Americans, they might not be great on things, but they do seem to really believe in federalism and liberty. We keep giving these things away. I would have said 20 years ago, with that track record and this fiscal mess and monetary mess, someone out there would have said, okay, we've got another currency that will replace the U.S. I don't see it. The U.S. is probably a more dominant economy relative to the rest of the world in the next 5 or 10 years than in most of our adult lifetimes. That is, those productivity advantages that Brian and Christy were talking about, most of those, if they weren't born in the U.S., they're being executed better in the U.S. The relative growth rate between what the U.S. can achieve and the rest of the world is widening in the direction of the United States. So the way I think about it is we've done our level best to destroy this economy, and we have failed. In spite of our best efforts, it turns out that economics in the U.S. has much less to do with all of us on stage and all these fancy jobs we had, and much more to do with all of you. What we used to teach in economics, we don't anymore, is what matters most in an economy is what we used to call the micro foundations of macro. But what is that? Here, this is a trigger word I'm using. One of the things that are the micro foundations of macro are the culture. What's the culture of that workforce? Well, American workers on factory lines and in services jobs are waking up and figuring out how to be more productive. Respect for the people that are working around you, an ability to have gains from working in groups, innovation, succeed, fail, try again. These aren't American birthrights, but they continue to be demonstrated here. I think American prospects are very good. And because of that, my view is the most important thing isn't whether the president or a Treasury Secretary like Bob says that we believe in a strong American dollar. The most important thing is that we say that it has been true and will continue to be true, that the US dollar will be the world's reserve currency. The world wants to do business in our currency. It makes us stronger and more prosperous. It makes these funding levels easier to achieve. So as much as I would have figured someone would give us a run for our money, I don't see it. And that's an incredible gift that the US can take advantage of, or we can give it up unwittingly to someone else.
I would agree with Kevin on this.
Sally?
And I would add one other thing that we haven't talked about this evening, and that's the regulatory environment. We've talked about education and higher education. We haven't talked about the regulatory environment, and most administrations, but not all administrations, have been smart enough to recognize that if you overregulate, you're going to strangle the entrepreneurs and those that are delivering the innovation, the creativity, the growth. And I think that is an area where the new administration is going to be moving us in a better direction.
Just one observation, if I may, Susan. And I totally agree with you. And I think excessive regulation is a serious problem. But I don't think you do it by slashing and burning without recognizing the purposes of regulation. I think what you do it is with a disciplined cost-benefit analysis, and then you make a judgment what is the best expected value. I have very little confidence that this administration will follow that path.
Christina?
I wanted to add to Kevin's list of what it is that has made the U.S. economy so strong, and you'll get no argument that entrepreneurs and workers are fundamental. But economic institutions and government institutions, I think, are also essential and part of what has made...
Universities.
And well, you'll get no argument for universities from me. But what's made the U.S. such a safe place to invest is, you know, we have the rule of law, and it's, you know, if you put your money in the United States, they'll give it back to you when you ask for it. And so I think that and likewise, one of the things that's been so important for our currency has been the fact that we have trusted the Federal Reserve to keep inflation low, and if it gets high, to get it back down. And if we mess with that institution and you know, do anything to weaken it, I think that's when you could see both slower growth and a loss of faith in the U.S.
All right, let's talk about inflation. During the Biden administration, there was a lot of criticism about inflation because of federal spending. It was a major issue in the campaign. Trump still keeps blaming Biden for even the present inflation. Ryan, could the Biden administration have done a better job at addressing inflation?
Since you were in charge of economic policy.
Well, let me do the economics first and then the politics. And I would say across the board, I think now is a good time for those of us who served and Democrats in general to do more questioning and thinking and being more humble and less categorical. So I'm sure and confident there are things that we could have done better. On the economics of it, it is the case that if you look at inflation, the best comparison is inflation here versus in the rest of the world. We had higher growth, better labor market outcomes, and lower inflation. The inflation that came down faster than in other countries. And economic performance overall and in the labor market that stayed more stable throughout that period. And so I think that if you look in terms of the American economic performance during this period, and by the way, that's, we often separate things in political cycles, but that is the pandemic economic response was happening both prior, in the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So the overall period, economic performance in the United States was uniquely good in the rest of the world. And also, we suffered a historic inflation shock, and inflation is creates uncertainty and hardship at the individual household level. And people, when prices go up, not only do people have to pay more, and even if their wages go up by the same amount, it creates a sense of uncertainty and an uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. On the politics of that, inflation is a political killer, and we've seen that in the U.S. We've seen that around the world. The anti-incumbency bias around the world is directly connected to a global inflation shock that has made people uncertain and uncomfortable. So I think on the politics, there will be entire books. There have been and will be entire books written on the ways in which the Biden administration or Democrats in general could have handled the politics better. That's not my comparative advantage. But I think on the economics, the most important lesson to take away is when we were in the midst of that inflation shock, most economic models would have predicted that the only way that you could get out of that shock was by having the real economy, having us go into a recession or having labor market outcomes where the unemployment rate would have gone up very significantly. We did not experience that. And then as a result, we have, right now, inflation peaked at 9%, but it's come down to below 3%. And I think that that's an important thing that we not lose in the politics of it, which is that the politics of inflation are brutal. The economic policy response to inflation is what's more important. And I think that we got more right than wrong on that front.
Is Kevin, is inflation Trump's problem now? Because he's obviously going to continue to increase tariffs, and most economists think that that'll feed into inflation. It's already beginning to feed into inflation. How is he going to respond? I mean, I know he's called it a little disturbance, but when people have to go to the market and buy things, and it's going to cost a hell of a lot more, it's going to be more than a little disturbance. How does he deal with that?
So if there's only one thing that all of us on this stage could agree is I think we would agree that inflation happens with a lag from policy. These are the famous long and variable lags between changes in monetary and fiscal policy and inflation. So it could not be after 55 days that this inflation is obviously this president's and not any prior administration. That is very bad economics. What is the most common thing that we hear among the political class is the inflation wasn't their fault, naturally. The most common explanation I hear from central bankers is inflation came about because of the pandemic and because of Vladimir Putin. No, inflation is a choice. The Congress gave that responsibility of stable prices to the Federal Reserve. And they've refined that statute many times, most recently in 1978. So it strikes me as uncomfortable for the central bank to say, it's not our fault, it's someone else's. Inflation is a choice made by our government. Quite simply, at the risk of speaking plainly, inflation happens when our government spends too much and prints too much. Inflation happens when our government lives too well. When those things happen, the private citizenry can't live as well as they should. We want the change in prices to be such in the economy that none of you are talking about it. But instead, over the last 5 years, including today, over most kitchen tables and most boardrooms, they're talking about what the heck's going to happen to inflation. That is a massive distraction from the decisions that you need to make. So ultimately, I do think that the presidency, this one and the last, will in part be defined by whether there are stable prices or not. And these unstable prices, they can be tolerated by folks like us in this room. But for hardworking Americans, 52% of whom own no financial assets, they don't have equity in their house, they don't have a Schwab account, they don't have anything except their W-2 income, their check every couple of weeks. And this inflation tax is the most regressive tax that does the most harm to the least well-off among us. Now, when we've been in policy-making circles, when there's a banking crisis, we rush to the rescue. When there's a financial market crisis, we rush to the rescue. And my friends in the central banking community, with inflation now running about 3%, much higher than their 2% inflation target, they've been cutting rates and they basically say not much to worry about. Our models say it's going to be swell. I can't help but note a difference in reaction function between what happens when asset prices fall and what happens when real incomes are under pressure.
Can I just do a really quick thing on that, which is, because I think the politics and the economics of inflation are fascinatingly hard, right? In the 3-month period after Russia invaded Ukraine, gas prices went up by $1 a gallon. That wasn't Joe Biden, and yet he wore it. Today, egg prices are really high. That is not Donald Trump, and he wears it, right? Or he will wear it. I do think that the thing that is hard for the president right now is that the one thing that has happened in the last 54 days is in the last 2 months, we've seen the biggest jump since 1980 in consumers' expectation of what inflation will be a year from now, which is a question that the Fed looks at a lot. So you ask, what do you think inflation will be 1 year from now? And in the last 2 months, that has gone up from about 3.5, a little close to 4, to almost 5%. And I do think it's hard to separate that from at least consumers being uncertain. Now, we don't know what is going to happen. But I think one of the hardest things that President Trump is going to face is if, in fact, the tariff policy in particular hits people in that way and creates that degree of uncertainty, how he manages that. Because I think, Kevin, exactly to your point, if you see something like that and that feels like the equivalent of a banking crisis, do you rush at it? Or do you say, well, this will, whatever, Leon, the word you used, a small disturbance? I think that is one of the biggest questions that we face.
One quick comment, if I may, Leon. Paul Volcker used to say that once something starts to trigger inflation, then inflation can get on a life of its own, inflation expectations. And I do think there's a real risk, Kevin, in precisely the way that Brian just described, that we now face that with tariffs. Whatever we may think about tariffs, it may well create the kind of expectations that Paul Volcker used to talk about.
I want to make a different
Go ahead,
but
Sally.
related point, which is inflation. There's a technical definition of inflation. And I would just point out that the tariffs are going to increase prices. And on certain things, people will notice that prices have gone up. Like on automobiles, prices will go up. The cost of constructing a house, prices will go up. And people will notice that. And the question is, and there will be other things when you go into a Walmart or you go into Target or you go into Dollar General, the prices of most things will go up. And they don't go down again, by the way. Once they go up, they don't go down.
No, they don't.
Even if the tariffs go down, they don't go down. So the question is, how fast does that happen? Some of it's happening already in anticipation. You know, the auto rebates. The rebates. When was the last time you saw a rebate offered on a car? They're gone because the dealerships are worried about, you know, the margin that they're going to be facing. So at what point do people start blaming tariffs? And I don't know the answer to that, by the way.
Christina?
So I want to, I'll join Kevin somewhat here in saying, you know, I think the inflation that we've been through, I think policymakers do take a lot of the blame for it. So there were supply shocks related to the pandemic, but both fiscal policy and monetary policy was too loose. And I'd even support you now. I mean, I think the Fed did a good job of getting inflation down. They jacked rates up. They were very serious about getting it down. And now they've at least paused. The part of this that where I'm having a little bit of a disconnect is Donald Trump has talked over and over about wanting interest rates to come down more. And that's, if anything, there's concern that there's going to be pressure on the Fed to loosen. And I think given, as I agree with you, inflation is above the Fed's target and it's getting stuck there. And so we're going to be facing a dilemma of, you know, can the Fed actually continue to fight inflation with that pressure coming from the president?
Should the president, this is a question actually, do you think the president should have a role in setting interest rates? Kevin, your baby.
You can pass on that if
No,
you want.
I'm not passing. You guys have put me right here in the lines, and I'm going to see whether I can tame this one. I think the central bank shouldn't be scared because elected leaders, even the President of the United States, expresses their view on their policies. Central bankers should not be so scared, so intimidated. They shouldn't be pearl clutchers. Oh, he was mean to me. Do your job. You've been tasked with making sure that prices are stable. Get at it. Fed independence is up to you. Politicians of all parties scream at central bankers to do this and that. That's why the central bank was created in 1913. The elected officials needed someone to blame, so they decided to move the set of responsibilities over there. It doesn't bother me, Leon, if the president and others express their view on interest rates. What bothers me is if central bankers take their eye off the ball of ensuring stable prices and decide that they're going to move into fiscal policy by buying treasury bonds from the Treasury, wander outside of their remit into environmental policies and everything else. Stick to your knitting, do your job, have credibility like Paul Volcker did. So when you do make a mistake, you can quash inflation instead of temporizing it so that it continues to be a dangerous tax on the least well-off among us.
Sally, let me ask you, we live in a it's not the world of the Gilded Age or McKinley. We live in a world that really is a world now that is connected. I mean, it's a global world. We're connected by communications. We're connected by security. We're connected financially. We're connected in so many other ways. Doesn't the United States have to be a competitor in a free market in a global world? Isn't that where we need to be? Not afraid of that market, not hiding from that market, but competing in that market with our goods. So isn't free but fair trade a good thing for the country?
I think it's definitely a good thing, but I think the prerequisite is that you have rules that are enforced. So that's the fair part. If you negotiate rules and your trading partners aren't sticking to those rules, then you need to enforce them, and sometimes that means retaliation. I think you need to be careful not to shoot yourself in the foot and jeopardize your competitiveness. I think you need to keep an eye on coalitions of the willing, because there are other countries and trading partners that believe in a more open trading system, and there are some that don't, and that have high barriers and do a lot of market manipulation, and those countries should be treated differently. So I think in the pursuit of the ideal of free and fair trade, you need good trade agreements, you need solid rules, but you really need to enforce them. Yeah.
Okay. Bob, let me ask you, the stock market's taken a hit lately, and it's in a correction area. Some say that, I think it's the Russell 2000 index, which is a small company index, is now slipped into a bear market. Are markets an accurate reflection of the economy?
I think I've been around markets all my life, and I did pretty, I ran Goldman Sachs, so I kind of know something about it. Or at least I thought I knew something about it. But I think basically, Leon, markets go up and markets go down, and I think what I worry about are the fundamentals with respect to our economy, and not what markets are doing day by day. I think there is a concern right now, which I think is justified, because I've now said this many times, that is affecting confidence, and I can see it in our clients. I think there's a lot of concern among CEOs. They don't want to speak out because they're afraid of retribution, but I think there's a lot of concern in the corporate community right now. I want to make one thing, repeat something I said earlier, though, because it really hasn't come up very much. One of the great strengths of this nation is knowledge, our knowledge-based institutions, universities, and that which the government has been very much involved in through DARPA and through other means of sponsoring research in critical areas. And I think all of that is being threatened by actions or purported or proposed actions or possible actions by this administration. I think it's a tremendous, that worries me a lot more than markets, tremendous threat to the future of our country. I'll repeat what I said a moment ago. The vice president on television said, professors are the enemies. I don't think professors are the enemies. I think professors are the guide to our future.
All right, let me ask each of you in the final minutes here that we have, if you could keep your answers as short as possible, to just give me a sense of whether you are confident or not confident about the future of this country right now. In other words, you've seen what's going on. You've seen the gridlock, the partisanship in Washington, the divisions in Washington. We've seen the mixed signals that have gone on. A lot of people are very worried about the future of our country. How do you feel about that? Let's go to each of you. Just give me a quick sense of where you think we are going in the future. Brian?
I think it's hard to be confident about anything right now. There are a lot of things that I am optimistic about. And I do think that it continues to be the case that you would rather have the United States hand to play than any other hand by a long shot. And so that's where I anchor. And I'll say the thing that keeps me up at night, and it may just be the age of my kids, is that for all the things we've talked about and all the policy drivers, the profound impact that AI is going to have and the profound impact that we're going to live through as a society with the first generation of kids that are screened and phoned kids and those types of dynamics, I think there's a reasonable chance that 30, 40 years from now we look back at this era, not from some of the things we're talking about here, but those profound changes, which I think will have profoundly positive changes, but we could be in for a period of 10 or 15 years of quite significant uncertainty in terms.
Okay, if I could ask each of you to keep it a little shorter. Kevin?
So he's probably not super popular on this stage, but William F. Buckley said, "Despair is a sin." I am not in the gloom and doom caucus. As Brian said, I'd rather have our problems than anyone else's in the world. Almost every challenge that we talked about on this stage, we might disagree of how to get it done, but these are choices and we know what to do. We know how to win the 21st century. The US is still where the world's talent wants to come. It's where the world's capital wants to come. And we have a system that can integrate those into our economies and create a higher growth rate such that this is a land of opportunity. So people that grew up in upstate New York can be on stage with Bob Rubin and with Leon. It's an incredible place.
You got a good point to that.
I think over the next 20 or 30 years, the U.S. will distinguish itself even more.
Okay.
And we'll find ourselves in a place where our allies
Thank you,
trust
Kevin.
us and our enemies fear us.
Thank you.
You want more gloom? Go ahead. That's all right. The rest.
No,
Sally, quickly.
I agree with what Brian and Kevin have said. I would also reiterate that somehow we managed to succeed in spite of our government, not necessarily because of our government. So,
Bob?
I'd rather invest here than any other place. I'm deeply troubled about our political system. And one issue we have not mentioned is climate change, which I think is an existential threat to life on Earth as we know it.
Christina?
Bob took my line. I was once called Obama's sunny economic forecaster, and I am feeling anything but sunny. I am really frightened about the rule of law in this country and our institutions, and climate change is, I think, a terrible problem that we're no longer dealing with.
Well, my sense is it's St. Patrick's Day and it's a good time for a drink. And so I want to thank all of our speakers. I think it was a great panel, and thank all of the audience. We need to keep doing this.
did you notice that somebody was smoking weed and
This was very good, Leon. It was very good. Really was.
We were stressing them out.
It was very good. It is a troubling.